Mick Philpott was not born a monster. Like all stories of darkness, his began in the shadows of an ordinary life. Born in 1956 in Derby, England, his early years showed no signs of the chaos and devastation he would later unleash. To some, he was just another boy growing up in a working-class neighborhood, a product of his environment. But for those who dared to look deeper, the cracks were always there, subtle and unnerving. If you believe that no child should ever be sacrificed for selfish reasons, subscribe to this channel. Only those who turn a blind eye won't act. Mick's childhood was defined by strict discipline and a father whose affection came in measured doses. His mother was a quiet figure in his life, overshadowed by a household that valued obedience over nurture. In his teenage years, Mick's personality began to shift. Friends described him as brash, combative, and fiercely protective of his image. But beneath the surface lay a deep well of insecurity. It was in his early 20s that Mick's darker traits began to surface. A failed military career left him bitter and restless. He began a string of turbulent relationships, each marked by a disturbing pattern: charm, control, and cruelty. He craved attention, whether through acts of heroism or intimidation. The world owed Mick something, or so he believed. To understand Mick Philpott's actions, we must step into the labyrinth of his mind. Mick was a man who thrived on control. Every relationship, every interaction was a stage where he played the leading role. His partners were not companions. They were pieces on a chessboard, maneuvered to satisfy his needs. Psychologists have described Mick's personality as one dominated by narcissism and sociopathy. He displayed an inflated sense of entitlement and a lack of empathy for those around him. To Mick, people existed to serve his desires, and when they didn't, they became disposable. His manipulative tactics often involved exploiting public sympathy. Whether it was feigning injury or playing the victim, Mick knew how to turn the narrative in his favor. He wasn't just the orchestrator of his life's chaos. He was its central character, always seeking the spotlight. Mick Philpott's home was anything but ordinary. He shared his life with multiple women, including his wife Mairead and his mistress Lisa Willis, under one roof. To the outside world, this arrangement seemed chaotic at best, but for Mick, it was the ultimate display of his control. He ruled his household with an iron fist, dictating every aspect of their lives. His relationships with his children were no less troubling. Mick saw them not as individuals with needs and futures, but as extensions of himself, pawns in his quest for validation. The more children he had, the more benefits he could claim, and the greater his influence seemed to grow. But behind closed doors, the cracks began to show. His volatile temper and oppressive behavior created a climate of fear. While Mick projected the image of a loving father and partner to the public, those closest to him knew the truth: a man consumed by his need for power and control. The seeds of Mick's ultimate downfall were sown long before the fire that claimed his children's lives. His obsession with control, combined with his inability to accept failure, made him dangerous. Lisa Willis, his mistress, eventually left him, taking her children with her. This was a blow Mick could not tolerate. Desperate to regain control and exact revenge, Mick hatched a plan. He would set his home on fire, framing Lisa as the culprit in a twisted bid for sympathy and custody of her children. But like all plans driven by desperation and arrogance, it was doomed from the start. On the night of May 11, 2012, Mick Philpott's world imploded. The fire he started consumed not only his home but the lives of 6 innocent children. While the nation mourned, Mick's facade began to crumble. Investigators unraveled the lies, and the man who once thrived on public attention found himself the focus of outrage and disgust. Before we dive further, if you believe that families deserve to be safe, that justice should prevail, and that no parent should ever harm their own children, not even by mistake, subscribe to this channel to see more videos related to this story. Because only those who condone such acts would turn away. Tragedy does not strike without warning. It creeps, unfolds, and waits for the perfect moment to shatter everything. For Mick Philpott, May 11, 2012, was that moment. But the seeds of this disaster had been sown long before. In Mick's mind, this wasn't an act of cruelty but a calculated move, a plan to regain control of a life spiraling beyond his grasp. The day before the fire, Mick Philpott was not a man grappling with guilt or fear. He was a man meticulously planning his next move. For weeks, Mick had stewed in anger over Lisa Willis's departure. She had taken her children and, worse, defied his authority. Mick saw this as a personal affront, a blow to his pride and a threat to his control. His plan was simple in its cruelty: set the house on fire, blame Lisa, and emerge as the grieving father who had lost everything. In Mick's warped mind, this would achieve two things. It would frame Lisa as a villain, and it would secure his place as the ultimate victim, garnering public sympathy and possibly even financial support. But behind this facade of confidence lay cracks in Mick's reasoning. He was not a master criminal, and the plan was riddled with flaws. Yet, in his arrogance, Mick believed he could pull it off. He spent the day rehearsing his story, ensuring Mairead and his accomplice Paul Mosley were on board. The fire was not just a means to an end. It was a stage for Mick's twisted performance. The night of the fire was deceptively ordinary. Mick ensured that his 6 children, Duane, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden, were tucked into bed. They trusted their father, oblivious to the storm he was about to unleash. The house was quiet, save for the faint sounds of a Derby night. Shortly after midnight, Mick and his accomplices set the plan in motion. Petrol was poured through the letterbox and ignited, the flames spreading rapidly through the house. Mick had underestimated the ferocity of the fire. What he envisioned as a controlled blaze quickly turned into an inferno. Trapped upstairs, the children screamed for help. The smoke was suffocating, and the heat was unbearable. Mick and Mairead, playing their roles, pretended to make desperate attempts to rescue them. But their efforts were a cruel mockery. The fire had already claimed their lives. By the time firefighters arrived, it was too late. The house was engulfed in flames, and the 6 children, aged between 5 and 13, were gone. Mick's carefully constructed plan had turned into an unspeakable tragedy. As the flames died down, Mick began his performance. Standing outside the charred remains of his home, he sobbed, clung to Mairead, and wailed about the loss of his beautiful babies. The community, shocked and heartbroken, rallied around him. Flowers and tributes piled up outside the house. Neighbors spoke of Mick's love for his children, unable to fathom the horror of their loss. Television cameras captured Mick's every move. In interviews, he appealed to the public for help, pleading for information about the monsters responsible for the fire. For a brief moment, Mick Philpott was exactly where he wanted to be, at the center of attention, wrapped in public sympathy. But cracks began to show almost immediately. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in Mick's version of events. The fire had started in a way that suggested arson, and Mick's behavior, though outwardly grief-stricken, raised questions. Why had he risked his children's lives for a scheme so reckless? Why had he placed them in harm's way without a clear escape plan? Forensic evidence pointed to the use of petrol, and CCTV footage revealed damning clues. As the investigation deepened, the public's sympathy turned to suspicion. Mick's image as a grieving father began to crumble, replaced by the horrifying realization of his guilt. In the weeks following the fire, Mick and Mairead were arrested, along with Paul Mosley. The community that once supported them now turned its back. Mick Philpott, who had spent a lifetime manipulating those around him, found himself alone, his lies unraveling under the weight of the truth. The truth, they say, always finds a way to surface. For Mick Philpott, the lies he had built his life upon began to unravel under the scrutiny of seasoned investigators and a public unwilling to forgive the unspeakable. But how does a man maintain a web of deceit so intricate and fragile? The answer lies in Mick's audacity and his fatal underestimation of justice. From the moment firefighters identified arson as the cause of the blaze, the investigation gained momentum. Mick Philpott's account of events immediately raised eyebrows. He claimed to have made heroic attempts to save his children, but neighbors reported seeing no such efforts. His story shifted under questioning, each version less believable than the last. Forensic teams discovered traces of petrol on Mick's clothing, a damning piece of evidence. The fire's origin point, the letterbox, aligned too perfectly with a scenario designed to incriminate someone else. CCTV footage near the Philpott residence painted an even clearer picture, showing movements inconsistent with Mick's claims. Detectives played a psychological game with Mick, knowing his ego would be his undoing. Presented with evidence, he became defensive and erratic, lashing out instead of cooperating. Paul Mosley and Mairead Philpott, under pressure, began revealing cracks in their accounts. The web of lies, carefully spun, started to collapse. As news spread of Mick Philpott's arrest, the public's initial sympathy turned to outrage. Mick's life of manipulation and exploitation came into sharp focus. The benefits system he had exploited, the control he wielded over his family, and his cavalier attitude toward his children's lives became the center of a national debate. Headlines branded Mick as a benefit scrounger and a monster. But this backlash wasn't just about his crimes. It was about what he represented. A man who had gamed the system, who had used his children as pawns in his schemes. For many, Mick was a symbol of everything wrong with society, and his downfall became a twisted form of public catharsis. Here's a question for viewers. Was Mick Philpott's exploitation of the benefit system the real reason for public outrage, or was it merely a convenient scapegoat for deeper societal frustrations? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss. The courtroom became Mick Philpott's final stage, but this time, his performance was exposed as hollow. Prosecutors laid bare the events leading up to the fire, painting a picture of a man so desperate for control and attention that he sacrificed his own children. Mick's defense team attempted to shift blame, suggesting the fire was an accident or that others were responsible. But the evidence was insurmountable. Petrol traces, testimonies from Mairead and Mosley, and Mick's erratic behavior all pointed to one conclusion. This was premeditated murder. Mick's demeanor in court further alienated him. He smirked at inappropriate moments, argued with witnesses, and showed no genuine remorse. His lack of empathy sealed his fate in the eyes of the jury. The trial, which gripped the nation, ended with Mick and his accomplices found guilty of manslaughter. But here's another question for viewers. Was the verdict too lenient? Should Mick have been charged with murder instead of manslaughter? Let us know your thoughts. In the aftermath of the trial, Mick Philpott's name became synonymous with manipulation, greed, and unthinkable cruelty. But the deeper question remains. How does society prevent individuals like Mick from thriving in the shadows? And can justice ever truly compensate for lives lost so tragically? Mick Philpott's case was more than just a horrific tragedy. It became a mirror for society, a reflection of deeply rooted issues from welfare dependency to media sensationalism, and the public's often polarized reactions to crime and morality. This chapter dives into the societal ripples that extended far beyond the tragic loss of 6 innocent lives. At the heart of the controversy surrounding Mick Philpott was his reliance on the UK's welfare system. With 17 children across multiple relationships, Mick's benefits totaled thousands of pounds a year. For many, he embodied what they perceived as the abuse of social safety nets. A man who used his children not as cherished family members, but as tools for financial gain. The case sparked a nationwide debate. Critics argued that the welfare system had enabled Mick's lifestyle, rewarding irresponsibility and exploitation. Politicians seized on the case to push for welfare reform, with some labeling Philpott the poster child for a broken system. But was this narrative fair? Others pointed out that Mick's crimes were rooted in his narcissism and control, not the benefits he received. Should a tragedy of this scale be reduced to a political talking point? What do you think? Was the welfare system to blame? Or is that an oversimplification of a complex, deeply personal crime? Let us know in the comments. As the trial unfolded, Mick Philpott became a media spectacle. Tabloids plastered his face across front pages, branding him with inflammatory headlines like "The Benefits Monster" and "Father of Evil." Television specials dissected every detail of his life, turning his actions into a macabre soap opera. While the media played a vital role in keeping the public informed, it also amplified the sensational aspects of the case, sometimes at the expense of the victims. The children, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, Jaden, and Duane, were often overshadowed by the man who caused their deaths. Here's a controversial question. Did the media cross ethical boundaries in its coverage of Mick Philpott, or was it justified in exposing his crimes to such an extent? Share your perspective. Public outrage. Voices of the community. The residents of Derby, where Mick Philpott lived, were thrust into the spotlight. Neighbors and community members who had once pitted Mick for his loss soon turned against him as the truth emerged. Some felt betrayed, having rallied around him in the days following the fire. Others expressed outrage, not just at Mick, but at a system they believed allowed him to thrive. Local interviews revealed a range of emotions: shock, anger, and heartbreak. "We thought he was a grieving father," one neighbor said, her voice trembling with emotion. "To find out he was behind it, it's unforgivable." Community leaders called for healing, but the scars left by the tragedy ran deep. Vigils for the children became moments of collective grief, overshadowed by the lingering question: how did no one see through Mick sooner? Mick Philpott's case didn't just expose the darkness of one man's actions. It forced society to confront its own values and systems. But where does the blame truly lie? With Mick himself, the welfare system, or the society that allowed him to thrive? And what responsibility do the media and the public bear in shaping the narrative of such tragedies? These questions aren't easy, but they're necessary. Share your thoughts below. What lessons can we learn from this heartbreaking case? And how can we ensure such a tragedy never happens again? Every tragedy leaves behind scars, not just on the direct victims but on the broader community, systems, and even history itself. Mick Philpott's crimes were no exception. The legacy of his actions reverberates through the lives of those he touched, the systems he manipulated, and the society that sought answers and accountability. As we conclude this story, we delve into the enduring impact of a tragedy that shook a nation. For the people who knew Mick Philpott, the psychological toll has been immense. His surviving children, now adults, carry the unimaginable burden of knowing their father was responsible for their siblings' deaths. The trauma of losing 6 loved ones in such a horrific way is compounded by the betrayal of discovering that the man meant to protect them orchestrated the crime. In interviews, former friends and neighbors of the Philpott family have expressed feelings of guilt and disbelief. How could we have missed the signs? Many have asked. This question has plagued not just those who knew Mick, but the wider community. The sense of shared responsibility lingers, a shadow that will not easily fade. Perhaps the most haunting question is this: how does one recover from such a betrayal? Can the surviving family members ever truly find peace? Or will the weight of this tragedy haunt them for the rest of their lives? Your thoughts are welcome. The aftermath of Mick Philpott's crimes ignited intense debates and calls for systemic reform. While the welfare system was scrutinized, the tragedy also brought to light gaps in child protection policies and social services. Policymakers vowed to ensure better oversight for families facing turmoil and to identify individuals capable of such calculated harm. But were the reforms enough? Critics argue that Mick's actions were so extreme, no policy could have prevented them. Instead, they highlight the importance of educating communities to recognize signs of abuse and manipulation, empowering individuals to report concerns without fear. Is it fair to say that Mick's actions forced much-needed change, or does that inadvertently assign him a twisted sense of influence? What should society focus on, better policies or the cultural shifts needed to prevent such horrors in the first place? Let us know your perspective. Mick Philpott is now serving a life sentence, with little to no hope of parole. From behind bars, one can only imagine the thoughts that cross his mind. Does he feel regret for the lives he took? Or does he remain defiant, justifying his actions as necessary to maintain his control over the people around him? In past interviews, Mick has often displayed an unsettling lack of remorse, blaming others for his downfall. But in the quiet of his cell, when the cameras are gone and the applause of his ego fades, does he confront the weight of his actions? Or is he so consumed by his own narrative that the gravity of his crimes eludes him? For viewers, here's the ultimate question. Do people like Mick Philpott ever truly acknowledge their guilt? Or are they incapable of change, trapped in a cycle of blame and denial? And if they can't change, what does that say about justice and rehabilitation in cases of extreme evil? The story of Mick Philpott is not just about a man who committed unspeakable acts. It's about a society grappling with the unthinkable, a system forced to confront its flaws, and the lives left shattered in the aftermath. As we close this chapter, we leave you with one final question. How do we, as a society, ensure that the legacies of tragedies like this one drive us toward betterment, not division? Share your thoughts in the comments, because conversations like these are where real change begins. Click that subscribe button now,